Right. So by way of introduction, my name is Rob. Work for Ping Identity in the EMEA team based out of London. Part of the CTO team there. Do a lot of work in the field as well. And a lot of what we're doing at the moment is really working with organizations pretty much across EMEA, looking at identity projects, digital transformation types of projects, a lot of work in the consumer authentication space, and also doing a lot of things specifically in financial services, in banking, related to things like open banking and PSD2. So obviously a lot of what sort of comes out of that is experiences around the mobile and getting people want to use these things and trying to figure out how we can make that better, how we can make that more secure. So let's talk actually a little bit first, maybe just a show of hands around the kind of strapline here, authenticating in a digital native age. I wonder, is there anybody in the room that might consider themselves a digital native? I'm not really expecting to see too many hands, but in digital I mean, like I look at my daughter, for instance, as an example of a digital native, right? People that have grown up with smartphones, and that's kind of what they expect as the default experience. I mean, everything they do, they want to do with their phone. So, well, let's kind of move on a little bit and let's talk about passwords. So who's heard the term passwordless mentioned at some stage since they've been here, right? So passwordless, I think in a lot of ways is the holy grail. We're not really doing a particularly good job with passwords, and everybody's sort of looking for ways to try and make that go away. So what I thought I would do in this talk is let's have a look at the mobile phone and let's have a look at if we can use this as a way to kind of make the password go away. So firstly, I mean, let's understand what the problem is here, passwords, and we're not really doing this particularly well. I don't think we've ever really done this particularly well because, I mean, it doesn't really work. This concept of authenticating using knowledge doesn't really work with the way people work, because I mean, knowledge is not absolute, right? I mean, it's like you know something today, but you might have forgotten that thing tomorrow. And there's also no way to guarantee that one person is the only person who has a particular piece of knowledge, right? Somebody else could guess that piece of knowledge or could engineer it out of them, right? So, so what do people do? People try to make their lives easier, right? Because the user experience around passwords is not always ideal. So we get things like this where the majority of people are using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as their password. Passwords become, in a lot of cases, trivially easy to guess or to engineer out of people. So, as an organization who's trying to keep your consumers safe, you want to try and do something different or better to help them. I'm not sure if anybody can actually read that, but there's an example of the kind of things that organizations will try to do to make this better, which is coming up with an absolutely impossible password policy to try and make these things complex. And to be honest, I mean, I don't really think as an industry we really understand all that well what is the right way to do this. I mean, password managers, this seems to be a pretty good practice, using long, unique passwords for each site that you access. This all seems to be pretty good practice. But then you have then you have organizations that are enforcing very bad practices. Like, I live in the UK. I have a number of bank accounts in the UK, and I mean, every time I try to authenticate to a bank account, for some reason they tell me I need a password. That password can be a maximum of 8 characters long, and each time I log in, I need to provide 3 random characters from that password. Because this is more secure, right? Because there's no way somebody can be able to intercept your password if you're only providing it 3 characters at a time. It's like, well, yeah, not if they only do that once. But so long story short, lots of issues with that. So then let's look at the mobile phone, and can we do this thing better? What are some of the characteristics, I guess, of a smartphone-based authentication approach? So well, let me actually before I kind of carry on here. It looks like I do need to use that back button. Show of hands, right? Let me sketch a scenario. So you're ready to leave home in the morning. You're on your way to work, you walk out of the house, you kind of lock the door, you're sort of halfway to the car, and you realize you've left your phone charging, on your bedside table. Right? How many of you will turn around, go and unlock the door, go back upstairs to go and get it before you leave? Yeah. No, it's the same thing. You've left your RSA token, not to pick on RSA. I mean, how many of you even know that you don't have it, right? So this is kind of the point. I mean, the point about the point about smartphones, of course, is that you've got a really good reason to have this thing. You take it with you anyway. It's useful to you. And there are a couple of sort of characteristics of the phone that we can use here, like the fact that we've got a built-in key store, where you can store a private key that can be protected using an on-device biometric. It's far more secure than other sort of multi-factor authentication things like, being sent an OTP via SMS or email. All of these things, they're very easy ways to defeat those. Particularly if we're doing this in a consumer kind of fashion, the organization can stay in control of the user experience, right? You can deliver a smartphone-based authentication app that's on brand, or you can build the ability to use the smartphone application as an authentication factor into a mobile app that your consumers are downloading and using anyway. And then, of course, again, just looking at the sort of the token or the hard token-based approach, definitely much better usability. As I said before, you've got a reason to keep this thing with you. It's not just some additional thing that ends up being on your keys. And you don't have to go and look for a code and then start typing the code into a page, and then you're halfway through and then it turns out the code is rotated, so then you have to do it again. Also, obviously, a lot cheaper to deploy at scale. You don't need to go and buy these things. Well, you could buy the things, right, if they're devices that you're providing, but you don't have to necessarily handle that whole process of rollout and all the rest of it. So we can definitely do things better with a smartphone app. But this is like the $64,000 question, right? Is can we eliminate passwords entirely? Are we close enough to the point where we can start to use the smartphone as the password, as the primary authentication factor? This is not something we say often in the security space anyway, but yeah, I think we can. I think that we've got enough options here that we can certainly start to look at. So, yeah. So what are those options? We'll talk about some of them that I've seen, some pros and cons. I don't think there's necessarily anything available out there right now that's an absolutely brilliant silver bullet, but there are certainly a lot of things that have potential, and with a little bit more work could certainly get there. I'm actually not already running out of time, which is quite strange, but I probably will be by the time we get to the next section header. So, all right, so let's look at the first thing, right? So this is something that I think we've been able to do for a long time, right? Pretty much any time you've got a second factor, you could decide to just get rid of the password entirely and say, well, Mr. User, why don't you just give me your username? And then I'll use the second factor if this is a push-based authentication to a mobile app. Well, that's great. It's pretty convenient. Give me your username, or remember the username in the browser if you've done it before. And then the only thing that you need to do to log in is accept this push notification. That push notification can be pretty detailed, giving you a fair bit of context about what it is that you're logging into. Now, as I say, it's been possible to do this for a while. Who's doing this today? Is anybody really doing this? Okay. To be honest, that's more than I was expecting, because it's not really something that I'm seeing a lot of. And I think that there certainly are a couple of advantages to doing this, but there are also I would say a couple of disadvantages to this, in that in some ways it becomes too easy to sort of launch an attack using this kind of mechanism, right? All you need to do is essentially guess a username. You could kind of start to spray those usernames into the sign-in form and hope that you can kind of dupe a user into accepting their push notification and get a session. Again, because of course it's sort of a front channel type of flow. There's always the specter of the kind of the man in the middle as being something that you need to worry about there as well. So it's definitely something we can do, but there are some other things emerging which might work better than this. So here's another idea. which, well, certainly we at Ping Identity will talk about a passwordless use case using this kind of approach of scanning a QR code. So the idea behind this is, well, you've got your mobile app, and obviously you've got your identity, which has been strongly established or strongly bound to that mobile app. We'll talk about that bit a little bit later because there's some big assumptions there. And so then what you're doing is when you're trying to log in, sort of via a browser or something else like that, you're essentially generating kind of like a session identifier or a code for that session, which you're encoding, as a QR code. Or, you can do whatever you like with this. You could make it a short number that you need to type into your authenticator if you don't want to do this. But essentially what this is about is a way in which you can then use the mobile app, scan that code, and then essentially have a back channel mechanism where the mobile app claims that session, sends the user identity, and then of course you can then do additional things. You can add an additional push after the fact to verify exactly what it is that you're doing. Say, are you sure that you want to do this, that you want to sign into this particular website or this particular application, integrated with on-device biometrics if you want to do that, and then generally come up with what I think is a relatively secure passwordless flow for doing this. I think you've got some of the same sort of potential drawbacks to this. You could put a man in the middle in front of this as well. The other thing is that I think that there's a level of sort of user re-education that goes along with this. I'm not sure how many consumers in particular are going to be all that familiar with using this kind of mechanism to log in, but it's certainly something I think that will change over time. So maybe again, show of hands, anybody evaluating this kind of approach for login, seen it, at least heard of it, think it's a reasonable idea? Okay, brilliant. So there's another option. Let's then kind of change tack completely and say, well, what happens if we're actually on the mobile, we're in a native app, and we want to do a passwordless experience. Well, here we can again take advantage of the fact that the mobile app is able to keep some things relatively secure internally, and most modern smartphones will give you some form of on-device security, preferably a biometric, whether it's Face ID or whether it's a fingerprint scan, or at worst case, protecting these things with a PIN or a lock screen or something else like that. So the idea behind how you do this is that within your mobile app, you're going to have some kind of initial login flow or initial sort of pairing flow, which is probably going to use a password. This is hopefully going to leverage something standards-based like OpenID Connect. This is what we hope. We hope it's going to be the auth code flow. That's not always universally popular once you start to talk to the app developers and they're like, what, I need to give up control of my wonderful user experience, are you mad? But whatever way you do it, essentially you need to have some mechanism of getting an initial set of tokens essentially to the app. And then what you can do is you can then use the on-device biometrics to protect access to those tokens. So it could be a case of storing a refresh token, requiring the user to authenticate with a biometric to obtain that refresh token and exchange it for an access token. The other thing that you could do, which I would argue you should do here, is to combine it with a solution that allows you to identify the device itself based on PKI, based on a private key within the device. So the check that you're doing at that stage is to say, I have a stored access token, or I have something else which is a representation of a user, and I want to compare some sort of a payload coming from this particular device to what I've seen previously for that user. And you can kind of build that flow all into a relatively seamless experience for the user within the native app that doesn't require entering a password, particularly doesn't require entering a password every time you use the app. And this again is certainly not particularly new or groundbreaking. I would say that this is fairly ubiquitous, and it's great for native apps. But of course, not everything is a native app, and a lot of time where the drawback starts to come here is that you're actually trying to build experiences that might go across different channels, across different modes of interaction. And the challenge here is to try and find a way to tie this together into an overall picture, an overall authentication strategy that might also encompass logging in via the web, or might also encompass identifying that user through other interactions. And again, not everybody is building native apps as well, I suppose, is the other concern here. So let's then look at some other cool stuff that's happening, right? So we've got FIDO2 and CTAP and WebAuthn, and there's absolutely wonderful set of standards. As you can probably tell, I start to get a little bit confused about what each one is called, but I know what these things are meant to do. And I mean, this is really giving us a lot of good advantages, I think, using this kind of approach. So essentially, what this is doing is it's a secure end-to-end flow, that goes via the user agent all the way to the authenticator, right? So the brilliant thing about using the FIDO2 approach or the WebAuthn approach is that this one actually is man-in-the-middle resistant. It is actually far more sort of phishing proof. Now, it's quite new. It's a set of standards that seems to have a lot of interest and momentum in the industry. I mean, I actually saw something about this standard written in a mainstream publication in the UK. I don't think it was quite as bad as like the Daily Mail or anything like that. It might have been the Telegraph. But the point is, it's very unusual to actually see anything about standards, technical standards, identity standards, actually being talked about at that kind of level where people in the mainstream are actually going to hear about it. So I think this is a really good idea. I mean, well, who agrees with me? You guys all kind of on the WebAuthn FIDO2 train? I think it's a good idea, Mike. I'm glad you like it. So there we go. I think it's going to take a bit of time to kind of get sort of bedded down. There are possibly some questions about the user experience here. I mean, the thing is about the authenticator itself, right? I mean, the authenticator can be just about anything. We've got a number of different factors for what that authenticator can be. We can use, let's say, a biometric that's actually built into the laptop in some cases, or we can use a token. But obviously, the idea here is that you're going to use the smartphone as the authenticator. I've got some screenshots here of what Google has done. That allow you, if you have an Android phone, I'm a bit of an Android fan, so I quite proudly have an Android phone. You can use that as a factor for signing in to Google. Now, the way they've got it set up at the moment is that's going to be set up as a second factor, but there's absolutely no reason why this couldn't be used as your sole factor. Again, as long as you're doing good things on the device to keep it safe. So let's then move on a little bit to my personal favorite, I guess, client-initiated back-channel authentication. I need to change where it says coming soon because it's coming now. Not doing any product pitches in this talk at all, but Ping Federate 9.3, which was announced yesterday, actually includes client-initiated back-channel authentication. And I'll do a bit of a shout-out to that man over there who's busy taking my photo, Brian Campbell, who together with a lot of other people has done a lot of work on the spec. But Seba is really interesting because what Seba does, it's an OpenID Connect standard. It's currently at implementers draft, but I guess stable implementers draft is where it's at. And essentially what it does is it provides a mechanism that you can use to obtain OpenID Connect tokens via a purely back-channel experience, right? So there's no need for a browser, there's no need for a redirect. Obviously, what it means is that you need to start off by having a pretty good understanding or idea of who the user is, so you know who to contact. And you also need to have some sort of an out-of-band authentication experience that you can use to fulfill this. So the smartphone app that can receive a push, that can display a transactional message, or what we call a dynamically linked message for the user to accept or approve is kind of key on this. But well, it happens to dovetail really nicely into exactly what we're talking about here. So I think Seba has a lot of potentially really good applications here, particularly when it comes to things like transaction approval or transactional authorization, going beyond that just, do you want to log into X, Y, and Z, but rather along the lines of, do you specifically approve this particular thing? Right, so now I think I am actually starting to run out of time.